It was the 12th of December 1992 when 20-year-old Arnold Archambault and his girlfriend Ruby Brugiere, 19 years old, disappeared in Lake Andes, South Dakota. Arnold and Ruby had been together since high school, where they'd fallen in love years before, and they had a daughter together in 1991, the year before they went missing. While it was acknowledged that they may have had their daughter too young, thankfully they had supportive families, and with the help of both families combined, they were able to make it work while trying to make a success of themselves through education and beyond. Arnold and Ruby were both Yankton Sioux, and they grew up on the reservation together, and it seems that most believed that they were the type of couple that was just going to be together forever. Arnold's family spoke very highly of him, stating that he was a nice and pleasant young man that had never been involved in any trouble. It was said that because of his personality, he was quite popular in the sense that he was just able to get on with everyone. Similarly, Ruby was described as a gentle person that had an infectious laugh that was great at cheering people up. Her parents described her as an honest person that didn't really put a foot wrong, but when she did mess up in somewhere, she'd come clean and tell them. This then brings us to the night before on the 11th. Arnold and Ruby weren't alone on this night, but were joined by Ruby's cousin, Tracy Dion, who was 17 years old at the time. The trio were on an all-night party spree together, and as said before, the families were very supportive and helpful with Arnold and Ruby, and they seemed quite closely knit. Tracy's father was looking after their daughter that night, and at around 6 AM, the trio arrived in the car at the home to pick her up and take her home. Tracy's father realised that everyone had been drinking that night, and while no one was completely out of it, said that he was happy to continue looking after their daughter until sometime in the afternoon, allowing everyone to get some sleep before they had to pick her up. With that, all three decided that they weren't quite finished yet and was going to go for a drive and spend some more time together before turning in for the night. Or the morning now, I suppose. So off they went, and from here, things took an immediate bizarre turn. This was a very cold morning, and the road was icy. As said, everyone had been drinking, and this was not a good combination. Arnold was at the wheel. It seems that the car must have hit a particularly icy stretch of the road, and the car jumped the highway and went crashing into a frozen over ditch upside down. Bizarrely, when the car was discovered by a concerned passerby who came racing down to see if anyone was hurt, the only person left in the car was Tracy. It has never been fully understood why Arnold and Ruby just seemed to have left and in what manner this happened. When Tracy was pulled out of the car, she was said to be in a state of confusion, because as she began to regain her senses, she could not make sense as to why Arnold and Ruby just seemed to have left her abandoned in the flipped car. And secondly, she didn't understand where they even went. She didn't hear anyone else nearby. She didn't hear them shouting or anything of that nature. They just vanished extremely quietly, it seems. Tracy said that the last thing she remembers was that they were driving and they all clearly saw a stop sign, but then something happened. I can only imagine the car lost its grip and slipped on the ice before overturning into the ditch. She said that there were no other cars anywhere to be seen at this time. To make matters even more bizarre, when the crash first happened, Tracy and Ruby were calling for help, but Arnold wasn't in the car. And as mentioned, Tracy didn't understand how he'd left or when. They called for him to help, but there was no response. On Ruby's side, the door was ever so slightly open, and in her panic, she got out, but as she did so, the door closed fully behind her, trapping Tracy in the car as she couldn't reopen it. Tracy was hit by a sense of total confusion because these were her best friends and she did not understand why she had seemingly just been left in there. She said that she would have helped them to get out if they were stuck, and it didn't make any sense. She didn't understand why both of them left, or even if they left together, because Arnold seemed to have disappeared first. Could he have been thrown out of the car as it was overturning? I have no idea, and Tracy didn't know either. That's a highly important question in this case. Why would they just up and leave her, now trapped in an upturned car where she could possibly have been hurt? It's hard to make sense of that. Perhaps Arnold bolted in a state of panic, thinking things were worse than they were, which caused Ruby to panic and bolt out of there alongside him. That scenario feels unlikely to me, though they had all been drinking at the time. Perhaps they thought that Tracy was in worse condition than she actually was, got scared and fled. Especially Arnold, who might have realised how much trouble he now might have been in. The scene left law enforcement baffled because by first light they were already out and about scouring the area for signs of the couple. The authorities were worried that because this area was frozen over, it was thought that in their dazed state they might have walked off together and fell through the ice at some other location. That in and of itself doesn't really provide any kind of an explanation as to why they left Tracy in the car, since at least Ruby knew that Tracy was conscious and trying to get out. Officers on scene wondered if the pair had walked over to the nearby lake for some reason, which was also frozen over. I'm not sure why they thought this. Did they find tracks? That wasn't made clear at all, but I suppose when you literally cannot find any trace of them anywhere, you have to start fanning out and covering further ground. One of the officers involved had a similar hypothesis to the one I shared earlier. His first thought was that Arnold might have bailed because he was driving when he really shouldn't have been, and he also said that scenario was quite common and is a situation he dealt with a lot. He also said that usually in this kind of scenario where the driver bails, the person normally shows up after a few days, but this never happened. Both sets of parents believed very thoroughly that something was not right here, because Arnold's parents stated that he would have called them and told them what happened, but they never heard anything from him after that night. Ruby's parents agreed with that assessment, stating that they knew for a fact she would never hide away and leave her baby for this long. Officers never found any evidence to suggest that Arnold and Ruby had fallen through the ice, and Deputy Ljungström turned this ordeal into something of a personal crusade. He knew none of this added up and wanted to understand what happened, and so worked constantly on this case. It was as if the couple had somehow vanished from the face of the earth. Now, if we haven't already, let's get bizarre. Around 3 months later, on the 10th of March 1993, Ruby's body was discovered floating in the same ditch that she disappeared in, and the following day, Arnold's body showed up, also floating in the ditch just a few yards away. The area around the ditch had been repeatedly searched for weeks after the incident, and even months after, as there were those who still went looking for them in the general area, wanting to be the person who solved the case. Because of these facts, it makes no sense whatsoever that the bodies were found just 75 feet away from the crash site 3 months later. It's one of those disappearances, and we've covered a number of them on the channel now, where every answer that you seem to get only raises further unusual questions. The only way in which people were able to make sense of this was to assume foul play, and you can absolutely see why. How on earth can you have a situation in which they vanish for 3 months, aren't anywhere to be found, and then there they are, quite literally right there in the ditch from where they vanished? You don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to understand that there's an incongruency there. It does very much seem like the bodies were placed there after the fact, but how and why? And by whom also? I can't imagine it's a particularly easy task to move a person that is completely limp like this, though at least you can make the case that it's possible, given that they were discovered there 3 months after the search effort. I remember something similar occurring in the Gaia Pope disappearance, which I'm always relating back to because it's one of the strangest cases I've covered and has always fascinated me. I'll link to my coverage in the top right now and the description below if you've never seen or heard of it. But in Gaia's case, she disappeared off a cliff essentially, completely vanished, but as opposed to this disappearance, her clothes appeared on a coastal path on said cliff. Then, on the following day, her body was found a stone's throw away from where the clothing was discovered, was the direct quote from some of the press outlets. The difference being, with Gaia, was that all of that occurred during the prime search effort, and it's difficult to imagine someone taking an incredible risk like that to place the body there. At least here, you could argue that it had been 3 months, and so most of the time there perhaps wouldn't be anyone around actively looking. It was a motorist that saw Ruby's body in the ditch approximately 75 feet away from the site of the accident. Bizarrely, her glasses and both of her shoes were missing. Aside from that, her clothing was exactly the same as the night she disappeared. The body was very decomposed. After this discovery was made, they pumped all of the water out of the ditch where they found Arnold's body the day after, approximately 15 feet away from Ruby's body. There was another incongruency. Arnold's body was not decomposed to the extent that Ruby's was, and authorities stated that his body had been kept very well. Investigators also made the point that there was a huge question mark in the disappearance, as they didn't know if he was wearing the same clothes as those in which he disappeared in, and it seems like this was never determined. Deputy Ljungström was said to be completely baffled at this entire event, and law enforcement didn't really have any great hypotheses as to why the bodies were in such vastly differing states of decomposition. He also didn't understand how both of the bodies ended up in the same ditch after the area was so thoroughly searched. I suppose the obvious answer one might jump to is that they must have fallen through the ice at a particularly weak and perilous spot, and the rest is history. Perhaps Arnold fell in first, Ruby got out of the car and quickly understood what was happening, tried to help and fell in as well. However, the counter-argument to this was that there should have been clear evidence in the ice to show that this had gone down. I'm no expert in this, but there were those who were asserting that the ice wouldn't have frozen back over in the time that had lapsed, or at least not fully. After the recovery of the bodies, they were sent for autopsy, of which the results only served to further confuse an already puzzling situation. The coroner was not able to determine the time of passing of either body, and there was no evidence that would suggest that they had been tampered with in terms of some kind of foul play or third-party involvement. The coroner, who admittedly seemed a bit stumped, at least from what I'm able to ascertain from various articles, went on to conclude that the pair passed away due to exposure. Deputy Ljungström was all over this and hit back, stating that he was not able to buy the idea that they passed away due to exposure alone. He said that they very well may have succumbed to freezing, but he did not believe that they froze in that ditch. He said that it was an impossibility that they could have been there for the entire 3-month period. He said that he had personally walked up and down that ditch several times during the period in which they were found and saw nothing. He also went on to explain that he had many affidavits from people who had also walked up and down the length of the ditch around the same time, and not one person had seen anything. He thoroughly believes they couldn't have been within the ditch at that time, as it would have been impossible to miss them given the now clear conditions. Police were further baffled by the discovery of 2 items that seemed to support the suggestion that they had not passed away in that ditch. They found a tuft of hair alongside the road, which DNA analysis later confirmed to belong to Ruby. There was not a good explanation as to how that hair could have stayed there for an entire 3-month period. Deputy Ljungström believed that the tuft only arrived at that spot when the bodies were brought back. though by whom, how, and why has never been understood. The second item was a set of keys in Arnold's pocket, one for a vehicle and two seemed to be house keys. It was never ascertained to what vehicle and property these keys were for. There was one credible witness who came forward and stated that she believed that she'd seen Arnold 3 weeks after his disappearance on New Year's Eve. She believed that she'd spoken to Arnold, who was driving a car with a couple in the back seat. The reason Ljungström believed that she was credible was because she knew Arnold personally, and she fully believed that it was him that she was speaking to. She said that there wasn't a doubt in her mind that it was him, and she also passed a polygraph test on this question too. The couple were also brought in for questioning and denied that they had been with Arnold, but they both failed the polygraph test. Despite extensive questioning, they held to their story and there was nothing more law enforcement could do. It's difficult to know what to do with that. I tend not to place too much weight on polygraph tests, but those results were particularly interesting. The problem is that they can be affected a lot by stress. So if the couple felt that they were in trouble or being accused of something, it's hard to know what to think about that, as interesting as it may be. So, how did both of the bodies end up in the very same ditch their car upturned into 3 months prior? Everything now is nothing but speculation, but it seems that some pragmatic thoughts and questions might be: firstly, the two bodies were in varying states of decomposition, with Ruby's body having the worst of it. Does this mean that she was the first to pass away with a significant timescale in between the two? That seems reasonable given that piece of evidence. In what manner might she have come to pass away? Was this an accident? Did she in fact pass away the very night of the accident? Perhaps she made her way over to Arnold, who was already outside the vehicle somehow, and then fell through the ice while trying to get to him. Arnold, seeing this and realising there was nothing that he could do and may very well have been held responsible for, especially because he was driving that night when he really shouldn't have been, and so fled from the scene and went into hiding. Now with that being said, in that scenario, I don't have much of an explanation as to why her shoes and glasses were missing. That suggests that both she and Arnold were removed or left the area somehow. Did she lose her shoes? Were they taken? I've no idea. If they were taken, by who and for what reason? To stop her from running away? What possible reason can you give for that? Again, law enforcement concluded that she was discovered in the same clothing as those she was wearing on the night of her disappearance, thus making it seem reasonable that she also may have passed away on the same night due to her state of decomposition in relation to Arnold's. However, I find myself in agreement with Deputy Ljungström, who seemed to come to the conclusion that they were not there for the entire time. As for Arnold, it's far more complex in even trying to come up with an explanation without throwing around wild accusations of which there's no tangible evidence for, so I'm not going to get caught up in that. To end, I found a number of the original articles that covered this case at the time of the discovery of the bodies. Here are some further quotes in closing and for additional context. "It's a very odd case," said Captain Vincent Merrick. "There was another individual in the car, Tracy, who couldn't get out right away. That's the last anyone has seen of them." Tim Whalen, Charles Mix County State's Attorney, said, "We're certain those bodies were not there at the time of the accident. It's not likely they passed away where their bodies were found. I don't believe that they did for 2 reasons. 1, they weren't there after the accident. 2, all of a sudden, the bodies show up March 10 and 11. The manner and time of passing is still under investigation." Tracy said, "I didn't see the two walk away. I don't think Ruby was hurt. She seemed alive and okay to me when I was in the car, but I can't say for Arnold." Arnold's aunt said, "I have so many questions, but there are no answers." It's been nearly a year, and authorities are still looking for answers. Law enforcement officials said that the two must have passed away elsewhere and their bodies were left in the ditch. Bill Ljungström said that he is searching for answers. Somebody out there knows something, and I have to find that person. Ruby's aunt said, how could someone not be there one day and then be there the next day, and their fate not have been met with foul play? I don't think anyone feels there wasn't foul play, and that's very frightening for a community. This whole incident seemed to have consumed Ljungström to some degree, who knew that this just didn't add up. It seems to me that one way or another, something very unusual, unexpected, and perhaps sudden happened that morning and went completely unseen and unheard by Tracy when she was stuck in the car, which frankly is nothing short of bizarre. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on this. What on earth do you think happened on that cold, icy morning? I was about to end it there and finish up, but I've had to come back and edit this in now, so I might sound a little bit different. Before finalising the video, I had one last search and I found something interesting. I'm not sure what newspaper this comes from, or the date of publication for that matter, but listen to this. Autopsy results indicated Arnold and Ruby passed away due to exposure. Officials also concluded the couple most likely did not pass away where their bodies were found but were moved there. The FBI, not Charles Mix County, is now in charge of the case because of a change in jurisdiction. Special Agent Matt Miller of the Southall office said this past week that the FBI closed the investigation because nothing suggests foul play. There isn't any indication of anything else, he said. All we know is that they appeared in the ditch and that was it. I tried to find out more specifics in regards to why the FBI took over the case, but other than noting the change of jurisdiction, I couldn't find anything else. But anyway, the FBI take over the case and then come to the total opposite conclusion of the original law enforcement team in charge of the investigation. The original investigators obviously concluding that the bodies had most certainly been placed there. Interestingly, the FBI didn't seem to offer any explanation at all other than saying, and I quote, "All we know is that they appeared in the ditch and that was it." Well, that all sounds very natural, doesn't it? I'm not sure how they just appear in the ditch and that's the end of the conversation. What do you think about this whole ordeal? In the early days of this channel, I covered the disappearance of Paul Lemaitre, who vanished from Mount Marathon in Alaska. At that time, I only covered this disappearance briefly, but really, the disappearance of this seasoned marathon runner and outdoorsman could be considered among the stranger cases out there. Let's get into it. This is Mount Marathon, located in Seward, Alaska, in the southern part of the state on the Kenai Peninsula. The mountain is named after the annual marathon race that takes place there. It is considered an extreme running event that occurs every 4th of July. The mountain itself stands just over 3,000 feet and isn't a particularly high mountain by Alaskan standards. But while it might not be too impressive in that regard, it makes up for in its steepness. Interestingly, this race initially began in 1915 and is considered one of the oldest annual races in America that attracts thousands of spectators and between 300 and 400 people who take part in the race. I suppose, with thousands of people present on the ground and that many people all running somewhat nearby one another, you might think that vanishing so thoroughly as to never be seen again might be quite difficult, and actually, you'd be correct in your assessment. As far as I'm able to ascertain, Paul has been the only person to have ever been recorded as vanishing on that mountain. There are obvious dangers that come with the territory of taking part in a race on a mountain like this. Accidents are not uncommon to have happen during the event, but having someone pass away or going missing to never be seen again is basically unheard of. Paul disappeared on the 4th of July 2012 while taking part in this marathon. Somehow, the only trail he left behind was a series of circumstances that made no sense and a whole host of unanswered questions. At this point in his life, Paul was either 65 or 66 years old, depending on the article you're reading, and had always lived in Anchorage, Alaska. Paul was a man that had always been known for his intelligence, high level of athleticism, fitness, and spending time in the outdoors, all of which seem to have been a great passion of his. There's this interesting quote that I came across on runnersworld.com. All of this marathon occurs between 3.1 to 3.5 miles, depending on your route and on trails so close to town that spectators waiting at the finish line can follow nearly every step high on the mountains. I'm sure that people would look like ants from that distance we're speaking about, but it is interesting that people who are familiar with this race describe for how the most part you're able to see the participants for most of the run. I suppose that does make sense, or the spectators wouldn't have very much to spectate. This was Paul's first time competing in the marathon, and I've heard the ascent be described as a scrabble up straight cliffs, mud and shale, and the organisers themselves made it known that this endeavour was not to be taken lightly. Peggy, who was Paul's wife, recalled that he received an envelope confirming that he could take part, but it also apparently read, "Do not make July 4th race your first trip up Mount Marathon." Some sources state that after reading the pamphlet, Peggy and their youngest daughter did try to talk Paul out of doing the race, but he was a determined man and seemed to be set on it. I believe that another attempt was made at dissuading those who had never been on the mountain before, as all of the runners were called up to meet at the local school's gym. They were reportedly told, if you have not been up that mountain before, you should consider going home right now and you should not be in the race. Sadly, Paul didn't heed this advice, though it does serve as a reminder and a warning that despite one's own ability, these kinds of areas shouldn't be underestimated. While the marathon route itself is not terribly long, it is known to be somewhat unforgiving in its intensity at parts. All runners start in the city of Seward and run approximately half a mile to the base of Mount Marathon. Upon reaching the mountain is where the ascent begins, up around 2,900 feet, at which point they reach the checkpoint before descending the mountain once more and back to the finishing line, which is in Seward. On that day, Paul lined up with hundreds of other racers ready to embark on this journey. Not knowing or understanding this would be the very last time he would do so. He was last spotted roughly 200 feet from the summit, but he never made it back down to the finishing line. Tom Walsh was a race steward who had completed this race every year for 16 years prior to 2012, so he knew the event like the back of his hand. Tom was present on the day that Paul vanished and saw him up there. Tom was very experienced and finished the ascent up the mountain relatively quickly, starting at 3:15 PM and reaching the top by 5:45 PM. He waited up there for more racers to gather, and as more and more reached him, many of them waited up there together for 45 minutes for the stragglers. At this point, as a larger group, they started to descend the mountain back down the way they came, where they came across Paul. Paul asked them how far he was from the top, and he was told that it was roughly 200 feet from the point they were. He went on his way, and it was estimated that it would take him around an hour and a half to make it back to the base of the mountain and to the finishing line in Seward. However, after this final moment of separation, Paul would never be seen again. He never came back down that mountain. Alaska State Troopers say a search is underway for a man last seen competing in the Mount Marathon race. Paul was seen by race officials about 200 yards from the top of the mountain. Trooper spokeswoman said Paul is believed to have poor eyesight and was not wearing his glasses. The weather in Seward has worsened and has been rainy and foggy. Cindy Clark, Executive Director of the Seward Chamber of Commerce, said, "I have never heard of this happening before." Cindy's comment there perfectly reflected the feelings of the searchers present who'd been looking all over the mountain for him. When Paul was first reported missing, people thought that it was going to be as simple as retracing the marathon route and probably finding an injured Paul who'd slipped and hurt his leg or something to that general effect. However, this wasn't to be the case at all. The whole track had been carefully gone over multiple times with highly coordinated search teams and search dogs in tow, but they weren't able to provide any clarity. It's as if they just couldn't latch onto a scent anywhere. Here's some information in regards to the search as it began. Search and rescue teams were called onto the mountain at around 8 PM by his wife Peggy, with temperatures falling and rain worsening. By 2 AM, an Alaska State Troopers helicopter, equipped with infrared radar, was scanning the mountain. Searchers worried that if he wasn't already injured, he probably had hypothermia because of his light clothing, exhaustion, and freezing weather. The next morning, the 210th Rescue Squadron of the Alaska Air National Guard, which specializes in searching for crash pilots and missing hikers, arrived with its HH-60 Pavehawk helicopter for another infrared scan. A team of up to 60 searchers crawled around the mountain looking everywhere, even the other side of the mountain, away from the race course. 4 days after Paul disappeared, the official rescue attempt was called off. What was particularly troubling to those searching for him was that based on many witnesses, they knew exactly where his last known position was. They brought tracking dogs to that exact location and they could not find a scent anywhere. It was as if he was just never there. A 72-hour search using tracking dogs, technical climbers, and helicopters turned up no sign of Paul. Searchers worked under the assumption that he had possibly wandered off the trail and suffered a fall. The odds of a man who was wearing only a t-shirt, running shorts, and shoes surviving 4 nights with wet weather and temperatures dipping into the 40s around freezing are not good. All 20 square miles of the mountain were examined without any sign of Paul. This was a perfectly reasonable conclusion that the search leaders were operating under, but what made absolutely no sense to them was the fact that nothing was coming up at all. The marathon route is well established and clearly shows where the racers are expected to be and where they're expected to go. Perhaps you could argue that because of Paul's not so great eyesight, he could have missed a key turning on the way down and ventured off into some other direction. It seems to me that you might expect the tracking dogs to be able to follow him in that scenario. In addition to that, because of the temperatures on the mountain, especially overnight and as time went on, hypothermia was going to become inevitable. So you could make the case that the reason he wasn't being found is that as Paul's body temperature dropped, he could have started to engage in the behaviour known as terminal burrowing, which may have hidden him very well. This is an attempt made by many who suffer from hypothermia to find small enclosed spaces and get into them as best and as compact as they can. Though this behaviour is often associated with paradoxical undressing. So, there are a number of problems with this hypothesis. Firstly, it still seems to me that the dogs should have been able to lead the searchers to this general area. This behaviour doesn't just magically cause the scent to disappear. Secondly, when a person enters this serious stage of hypothermia, they're usually going to be leaving a clothing trail as their vascular system begins to severely restrict, which causes a fake sensation of intense heat or burning. It is this fake heat that causes people to shred the clothing, but none of that was discovered anywhere. It is also interesting that the searchers were stating that all 20 square miles of the mountain had been searched without any signs of Paul anywhere. Dogs were said to have been used extensively throughout the duration of the search, so I can only imagine that they'd practically covered the entire mountain at one point or another. It's just fascinating that the route up is approximately 1.5 miles up and then back down the same distance. There were hundreds of runners within view of the thousands of spectators at the bottom, and yet Paul seemingly managed to vanish into thin air without leaving a trace behind. The dogs failed to pick up a scent anywhere, and the thermal imaging equipped helicopters never found anything either. It did become rainy and foggy, it was already cold, and they were quite high up on the mountain. Could these conditions have wiped Paul's scent clear so thoroughly that it just couldn't be detected anywhere at any point? When going through the articles, it seems that the dog handlers were expecting to find something, and these are professional search teams, so you'd imagine that they have a fairly good grasp of what to expect from their dogs during these kind of searches. It's been more than a week since Paul disappeared, but his family isn't giving up searching for him. Mary-Anne Lemaitre says she goes out with search crews looking. Family and volunteers have continued to search the mountain even after Alaska State Troopers called off their efforts last weekend. The runner was spotted by volunteers who ended their day on their way down the mountain. Troopers, mountaineers, and dozens of volunteers have found no sign of him. The official search came to a close after 4 days, presumably because the conditions on the mountain would have made it impossible for someone under Paul's circumstances to have survived after that. An unofficial search continued though, and in fact, over the years, thousands of hours were spent on that mountain looking for him. Volunteer firemen, state troopers, outdoorsmen in general, tracking dogs, nor anyone else has ever found even a single trace as to where he might have vanished to. No footprints were reported to have been discovered, there were no signs of a struggle or animal predation anywhere. No items belonging to Paul were ever found, there was quite literally just nothing anywhere, and searchers commented that this was very unusual, and I agree with them. That is not typical at all. It seems that they at least expected to find something that might indicate a direction that he took, as is usually the case when a person requires help in an area such as this. Especially when you have such a precise location to begin the search from. It's actually very rare to just find nothing at all, and it's atypical. Perhaps not in the disappearances that I cover on the channel, but it's important to realise that they are few and far between, and I spend a great deal of time looking for them specifically. Peggy Lemaitre no longer holds out hope that her husband will be found 5 weeks and multiple searches after he vanished. A group of doctors who works with Peggy's daughter, Michelle, a nurse, have arranged to have a cadaver dog flown up from Oregon. A friend of the family paid for helicopter search time. Another friend took high-resolution photos of the mountain, studying them for hours on his computer, but there was nothing, not a trace. It's honestly very difficult to imagine how the family must have been feeling and what they were thinking. A lot of heartache and confusion, I can only imagine. There didn't seem to be too many ideas running around either. As said, the most common was that Paul may have veered off the track and had fallen somewhere. This is reasonable, but it quickly seems to become somewhat dubious when you then question as to why the tracking dogs weren't able to find his scent anywhere. Also, these thermal imaging equipment are actually really quite good. In this instance, they were said to be so sensitive that they should have been able to see his footprints left in the snow, and they began their search at 2 AM, which is just a little over 8 hours after he vanished. Even if he'd passed away for one reason or another in that time, you'd think they would have found some tracks somewhere. It's actually very unsettling to me, especially when you consider that while Paul hadn't been on Mount Marathon before, it's not like he wasn't experienced with the outdoors in general and these harsher areas. Based on what I can find about Paul online, he'd engaged in many wilderness races and entered cross-country skiing competitions despite not having much experience in those either. He was said to be always out camping and sailing with his friends, and somehow managed to find the time to get a PhD in business and administration. He was a very intelligent man, which is obvious anyway because it's incredibly difficult to obtain a PhD and requires a very intense focus on a specific topic for a prolonged period of time. The final piece on Paul that I could find came in 2021, where ADN.com posed the question, was there ever any sign of the Mount Marathon runner who vanished during the race several years ago, which would be 11 years now? They basically reiterate everything we've spoken about thus far, But they added that a lawsuit brought by the Lemaitre family changed the rules of the race to make it safer. The family achieved their objective, and now, in order to take part in the marathon, participants must now complete the 3-mile course at least once prior to the race day. Or in other words, they must go practice on the mountain before being allowed to compete, which is probably how it should have been to begin with. In relation to the question posed a moment ago by the article writer, they relay some quotes by others. "The mountain swallowed this man," a relative told Runner's World journalist Christopher Solomon. An Alaskan state trooper spokesman said, "No clues, no trace, no trail." So, how did this man come to vanish so thoroughly without leaving any form of a trace behind? The only scenario I could come up with was terminal burrowing as a result of hypothermia, aside from the potential fall that was mentioned. However, I don't think either of those explanations fully capture everything because the dogs could not find his scent anywhere. Again, perhaps at that kind of elevation with the fog, rain, and whatever other conditions were present, it made the scent fade. But searchers seem surprised that their dogs weren't able to locate anything, which seems quite telling to me. I've pretty much exhausted all of the material I could find in relation to Paul, so it seems that now would be a good time to hand it over to you in the comments below. On the 29th of June 2013, a Texan man by the name of Mitchell Dale Sterling vanished without a trace after wandering off from his family in the wilderness of Colorado's Mesa Verde National Park. This place, situated in southwestern US, has a whole unusual and rich history in and of itself. Inside the Mesa Verde National Park, you can find the remnants of a long since past peoples. Their presence is known today because they left behind over 5,000 ancient landmarks, including 600 cave dwellings. Numerous watchtowers and petroglyphs, among other types of buildings, are now ruins, I suppose, including the sunken ceremonial sites known as kivas. This is interesting in and of itself because I'm not sure that we know the exact reason that the people back then abandoned this site. In any case, Dale, who was 51 years old at the time of his disappearance, was travelling with his wife and parents from Texas through Colorado. This was a family that loved to hike, and Dale himself was a very experienced hiker who'd been doing this kind of thing for a long time. Visiting Mesa Verde National Park was actually an unplanned visit that day, as they had some unexpected car troubles that forced them to stop. This was a beautiful, warm summer day and there was high visibility, so they arranged for their car to be sorted and then headed to the visitor centre in the park, which they arrived at around 4:30 PM. As said, Dale was an experienced hiker, and it seems that as the rest of the family were relaxing inside the visitor centre, he decided that he wanted to see the Spruce Treehouse ruins, which were around 400 metres away and I believe are visible from the centre. Because of this, Dale expected this to be a relatively quick trip to and from, and so didn't bother to take any water with him, which was a mistake because this would also be the second to last time anyone ever saw Dale again. Things take a strange turn now because as Dale was heading towards the ruins, he came to an intersection, which one path leads to the Spruce Treehouse and the other leads to a longer trail called the Petroglyph Point Trail. Despite it being longer and more hazardous because of various cliff edges and a steeper climb at parts, it is not considered a dangerous trail, at least as described by various articles and trail reviewers. The trail itself is also a loop, so even if you follow the entire 2.4 mile trail, in theory you would just end up back where you started. Dale was spotted on this trail by another family who made small talk and had a pleasant chat before they all continued on their respective walks. This means that Dale, unfortunately, had now been confirmed as having gone down the wrong trail. The trail in question is described as follows. The trail is generally considered a moderately challenging route. This is a very popular area for birding, hiking and running, so you'll likely encounter other people while exploring. The best times to visit this trail are March through November. So clearly, Dale did encounter other people, and according to alltrails.com, he also went at one of the best times. Reviews of this trail are also fairly consistent, with the general gist of it being that firstly, it is relatively easy to follow the trail, and secondly, that while not particularly difficult, it does get a bit rocky with ups and downs through some of the terrain. Commenters also suggest that the loop doesn't take very long to complete either, depending on how easy you want to take it, of course. This then is quite an interesting description, especially the part that the trail itself is easy to follow and accidentally straying from the trail, in theory then, should not be so much of a problem. So why then was this the last known time anyone ever saw or interacted with Dale again? A search of cliffs and trails has failed to turn up any sign of a Texan man missing since Sunday in Mesa Verde National Park. Park spokeswoman Betty Lawrence said Thursday rescuers are continuing to search the canyons and trails for 51-year-old Mitchell Dale Sterling. Sterling was reported missing by relatives who are at the park awaiting word. From what I can gather, obviously, this was supposed to be a very quick trip for Dale to and from the ruin. It's not clear how long the family waited before reporting him missing, but I can't imagine it was too long from the point that he left. I would assume that we're talking a matter of hours because articles state that the park rangers were on this quickly, and when after they searched the ruins, they came to the correct conclusion that he must have gone down the petroglyph trail instead. Interestingly, and as confirmed by the reviews of the trail earlier, the rangers weren't worried about this, just stating that it would be best to wait an hour or two to allow him time to complete the loop or to come back the way he came. However, after this time had lapsed and he still wasn't back, the rangers once again sprang into action, though this time was soon to be joined by other professional search and rescue squads. This is one element of this disappearance that makes it all the more unusual because searches usually aren't initiated so quickly. Usually, you have a situation in which a person has been missing for days or sometimes even a week or more before the search gets going, but this was pretty immediate, relatively speaking. Also, in addition, this must have seemed very hopeful to all concerned, especially after they had the confirmed sighting by the other family on the petroglyph trail. This, as described by others, was an obvious trail that fortunately wasn't too long, so it seems to me that all concerned believed that they were going to find him quickly. And I would assume that they, the searchers, assumed that he had most likely hurt his leg or something similar while on the trail, as opposed to leaving it for some reason and getting lost. There's also something to be said about having such a precise location to search, because that usually doesn't happen either, or at least nowhere near as specific as this case. Right from the get-go, they quite literally knew exactly where he'd been. Again, sadly, and I hope that this serves as a stark reminder and warning to others, Dale decided that it was going to be so quick that he didn't need to take water with him, though he did have his mobile phone. It was said that there was signal within the park, though intermittent, but no one received any word from Dale. Records showed that he tried to access his voicemail at around 7 PM the night he disappeared, and before this, the rangers had traced a single ping to his phone. These areas were searched extensively on foot, with dogs, on horseback, and they still couldn't find even a hint of him. As I'm sure that you can imagine, searching a national park for a missing person is an immense task, but as said, the situation was made somewhat better here in the sense that they pretty much had an exact place to search and fan out from. For the first 2 weeks, the search effort was at its most intense, with many boots on the ground who scoured the landscape for him. Search dogs were also called in throughout the entire duration of the search and who also went up and down the petroglyph trail, who from what I can tell, never picked up a scent at any point. Jesse Farias, who is a chief ranger for the national park, effectively said that they'd had numerous search dog teams go up and down the area, even many months after the disappearance, and none of them picked up anything. I would assume at that time, the hope would have been that the dogs might have picked up the scent of remains. The searchers themselves were said to be having difficulties in understanding what could have happened here, because despite covering a rather large area now, they still had found nothing. It was at this point that specialised mountaineering units came in who rappelled down into the canyon from positions all along the trail, but their search failed also. Helicopter teams armed with thermal imaging technology also got involved in the search, hoping to spot his warmth, especially at night, but other than animals, they never found anything. I did find this account of a writer and hiker named Jodie Peterson who wrote this in 2013. I believe that she was in the park the day following Dale's disappearance and also documented this the following day too. After an hour of walking, I suddenly heard a weary male voice call, "I need some help." I thought of the missing hiker. Perhaps after visiting Spruce Tree House, he'd attempted this trail and run into trouble. I called out several times but got no response. I thought about going off trail to look, but figured I'd become lost as well if I tried to scramble down those ledges and cliffs. My phone had no signal. I hiked back down the trail as fast as I could, and when I found the chief ranger, I told him what I'd heard. Relief washed over his face as another staffer said, "We thought we heard a call for help in that area yesterday." They quickly began planning to bring in dogs and more searchers. I left the ranger station and stood looking at the opposite side of the canyon where I'd heard the call. When I got back to my western Colorado home the following day, I checked the news, thinking I'd read that the hiker had been found. Instead, I learned that Mitchell Dale Sterling was still missing and now 70 people were looking for him. I think that Jodie made the correct call here. The worst thing that could have happened in this situation is that you also become lost while trying to help. Now, what I do find particularly frustrating is the part where she says that the ranger said that they thought that they'd heard a call for help the day before, literally on the day that Dale disappeared in the same area. It seems to me that if you believe that you'd heard a call for help, is that not grounds to begin an immediate extensive search? It's difficult because I suppose if you're in two minds about what you actually heard and you're not completely sure, then you call out to this person but get no response. It's difficult to make that decision now because you'd be second guessing yourself and terrified of wasting everyone's time. It's difficult to get a sense of timescale here, especially when the family were told to wait for an hour or so. It's not clear to me when the staffer heard this call for help. Anyway, whatever the case may be, despite having this now absolute precise location where the two calls for help had been heard, and fanning out from that spot in the direction the calls were made, the searchers could find nothing. They shouted for him and tried to make themselves known. They brought dogs to the area, but nothing seemed to work. No more calls were ever heard after this. Obviously, it's not known for certain that Dale was the one calling for help, though given that no one else had been reported missing or anything, it seems reasonable to assume that there was a good chance that it could have been him, especially because the calls for help were heard on two separate and consecutive days. Despite an intense search effort with dogs going up and down the area, with boots on the ground and helicopters up in the sky, they never saw or heard anything else. The trail for Dale would go cold for 7 more years before in September of 2020 his remains were found. Cliff Spencer, the Mesa Verde National Park superintendent, said that they were given an anonymous tip about a discovery of a body. The reason it was sent in anonymously was because this unknown hiker was in a remote section of the park that was off limits, and it seems he didn't want to get into trouble. Cliff said that Dale's remains were found quite a distance away from where he was last seen, and he travelled 4.2 miles off trail. Interestingly, this area had been searched multiple times 7 years prior in 2013, but they were unable to find him. The coroner, George Devers, said that he is 99% sure that the remains are Dale's because his driver's license, credit cards, and a social security card were all present. Cliff continued, stating that it would probably be impossible to determine a cause of passing at this point, though noted that foul play wasn't suspected nor animal predation as there were no signs of that. Many of the bones at the scene were bleached, and Cliff said it probably isn't possible to perform a DNA test on them. In addition, and to clarify, Cliff noted that this off-limit area was at the bottom of a canyon and is believed to be the exact spot where Dale passed away. So I suppose what's being said then is that they don't believe that the body had been moved. There are some fairly unusual aspects to this. Firstly, the assumption made at the time of the initial searching, especially around 2 weeks in, they believed that they were looking for a body. It was also surmised that if he was in this general area, the search dogs would have led them straight to him because of, and without trying to be too descriptive, the potent smell that would have been present. Other than saying that he was found in an area that was already searched at the bottom of a canyon and stating that it was 4.2 miles away, authorities, as far as I can tell, never gave anything more precise, so I've no idea where he was actually found within the radius. Though at 4.2 miles away, that would make it right at the edge somewhere, presumably somewhere here given that this was the trail. I suppose that they might not want to be so forthcoming with that information as to not attract people into areas that they shouldn't be, but it would have been interesting to know. I can only assume it was to the south. I've no idea. I also have no idea where the call for help was heard, nor where he might have left the trail. Dale was considered a seasoned hiker, so it's hard to imagine that he just strayed from the trail, at least under normal circumstances. Sadly, as said before, he chose not to bring water. Is it possible that he became delirious at some point down the trail because of the heat? There were no signs of animal predation, making this next suggestion less likely, but I have heard of those that have been pushed from the trail by an animal, not so much physically, but if you spot something that makes you uneasy and panicky, I could imagine backing away in the wrong direction and then quickly finding yourself in a situation where you're now just completely lost. Obviously, this is nothing more than speculation now, but it is surprising that the initial search effort was unable to find even a trace of him. At this point, while reading about Dale and the park, I came across a number of articles discussing various Native American tribes' view of this place, which just comes to add an air of creepiness to this whole incident. It's stated that the Ute people and the Navajo people don't venture out to these areas and have warned others of doing so. I'm not sure if that might be one of the reasons that these areas are supposed to be off limits in the first place, perhaps out of respect, and perhaps the area is just somewhat more dangerous also because it hasn't been tended to by people in a long time. In around 1200 AD, it's thought that the ancestral Puebloans held a population of approximately 30,000 people in this place. But for some reason, that isn't completely clear to this day and is still debated, they had all vanished and left the area by 1280. All of the abandoned structures were then left dormant for the next 600 years, I believe, when cowboys rediscovered the site in the 1880s. I would also assume that Native Americans in the area knew of this place, as it's considered sacred to the Ute and Navajo tribes respectively, but as stated, they would not venture there. These things tend to be somewhat esoteric and perhaps abstract in places too, but the native people have stories and beliefs in relation to this place. They believe that and warn others of disturbing these areas for fear of awakening what they call the Chindi, which they believe are some kind of malevolent spirit. While unlike other beliefs and legends held by the natives, there is nothing specific I can find in relation to the Chindi and people going missing. However, the stories hold that the Chindi cause physical illness, psychological distress, and general misfortune, or in the worst case, cause a person to pass away. I suppose those who believe in such things could argue that those things could generally cause a person to become disoriented and lost. It seems to me that if the natives of a country warn you about an area, you should probably just listen and take their advice in general. Because even if they hold the more esoteric beliefs about an area in terms of spirits or something else, it's still worth heeding their advice because they are still probably telling you that an area is dangerous for good reason, even if you personally think that the reason given is misguided or whatnot. And in that scenario, the only thing you lose is not seeing a particular site. And also, on that note actually, it's probably not a good idea to be disrespectful to the locals either. Obviously, none of that applies to Dale, because he just became lost inside the park and will have had absolutely no idea where he was. At the time, Jody reasoned that Dale had probably tried to take a shortcut back down from the petroglyph trail towards his family and then fell. That would explain the calls for help, and it would have been very difficult to spot him if he'd fallen into a crevice. But 7 years later, he was also found 4.2 miles away from the point he was last seen, and was now discovered in an area that was quite literally off limits. So I'm not sure that completely checks out either. We can also reason that the spot Jody heard his call for help was probably nowhere near an area that was considered off limits. And far more likely, she was just on the trail itself. So it's hard to imagine he'd fallen, was hurt, and then travelled all that distance away. Just to clarify that point, Dale Sterling's body was found on September 17, 4.2 miles from where he was last seen and more than 2 miles from the nearest trail. A set of bones and clothes along with several IDs and credit cards were found at the base of a lone tree in the bottom of a ravine. Chapin Mesa, the section of the park where Sterling's remains were found, was searched pretty extensively in the weeks after he went missing. How it was that he was missed at that point, we may never know, said the park spokeswoman Christy Brown. Well, that's very reassuring. I suppose Christy was right though. All of the details as to Dale's movements and what exactly happened will never be understood now. People involved in the search at the time called this whole ordeal a head scratcher, and you can see why. It very much seems like Dale should have been found fairly early on, given everything that happened and having a specific location the way they did, and especially including the 2 calls for help. It's also interesting that the area that he was later found beneath the tree had already been extensively searched multiple times before, so he'd either been missed or just wasn't there at all at the time. I've just had to come back and edit this in, but I also found an article that stated that his remains were found west of Durango and to the east of the park, so he was found somewhere around here in that case? That's very odd. It's difficult to understand how that then happened. It seems that from the point he vanished, you'd quite literally have to cross a road at some point. Perhaps they just assumed east of the park because it was stated west of Durango? Surely they have to be wrong about that. I honestly have no idea, and on that point of confusion, that also brings us to the end of the paper trail. This was a very confusing, and frankly, frustrating disappearance. It's such a horrible shame that there wasn't a different outcome here. Let's begin in the UK with David Plunkett, who was 21 years old in 2004, where he studied event management at Leeds University, while also working in some voluntary roles from box office to bar work. At the university itself, alongside his places of work, David would get to know the local community, and he was described as a bright, friendly, happy, and an outgoing young man. He was well liked, and nobody could believe the circumstances of his disappearance. On the night of the 17th of April 2004, David and one of his friends, Michael, found themselves on a mystery tour night around Manchester. At some point during that night, both he and Michael went to a Budweiser event at the Daytona racetrack in Trafford Park. This was an invitation-only music festival and saw DJs and bands playing, and as you can imagine, initially they were having a great time. All the guests had 6 tokens that they could use to get drinks, but sources indicate that after a couple of the tokens were used, free drinks ended up just being given out. It seems that David and Michael both had too much to drink, and at some point they had gotten separated and couldn't find one another. It's not completely clear what went on, but David ended up being thrown out by a security guard because he'd had too much. As David was leaving the music festival, this would be the last time he would ever be seen again. From what I can tell, I do not believe that Michael was even aware that David had been thrown out and was still trying to find David in the crowded festival. While on this now futile search, he made several phone calls to David, but each went unanswered. At 1:10 in the morning on the 18th, David's parents, Anne and Mike, who lived in Halifax, received a phone call from a now worried Michael stating that he and David had lost one another and that he just couldn't find him. David's mother reassured him and stated that she would essentially take over and start calling her son's phone. She was able to reach David at 1:15, I believe, so roughly 5 minutes from the call with Michael. The Manchester Evening News reported this. Mrs. Plunkett said, "We rang, and when David answered, he was incoherent. There was no noise in the background, and it struck me that he was on his own. 10 minutes into the phone call, he started screaming. He was howling and yelling. It was horrendous." Anne handed the phone to Mike and dialed the emergency services, but little could be done because they did not know where he was. They managed to keep the phone line open with David until 4:30 in the morning, but there was no further contact. This obviously was highly unusual because as far as Anne was concerned, it was oddly quiet up until David became scared for some reason that has never been determined. She also said that at no point did she hear anyone else. So what in the world was happening, and what was David seeing? Just for some further context here, David's parents stated that he sounded confused, afraid, and obviously somewhat aggressive too. Apparently, he was swearing and using words that he hadn't used in front of them before. 10 minutes into the call, at 1:25 in the morning, he said to Anne, "I'm turning right, turning right, turning right." 3 times he said this before he broke out into the scream. He was still screaming as Mike was past the phone. Then once more, everything became deathly silent despite the phone call still being connected. Again, to reiterate, no one else was heard for the duration of the call when it ended at 4:30 in the morning. Obviously, I suppose, his parents believed that he was being attacked, though it's just bizarre that no one else was heard during this ordeal. Records with the phone call with Anne showed that he answered the phone somewhere between Salford Quays and the Old Trafford football ground. These locations are separated by the River Irwell, but a bridge on Trafford Road allows passage. David's parents stated that he sounded spaced out and not really with it. Mike described the scream as an unearthly howl, and that he'd never heard anything quite like it before. Again, what I find absolutely bizarre and puzzling about this was that as the parents described, there was no background noise at all. Anne said the scream was so sudden and came out of nowhere. It was as if someone had startled him. It came right out of the blue. That's what scared me so much. I had never heard him scream, and he had never sworn in front of me before. A major search effort was initiated, but nothing would be discovered until 2 weeks later, on the 30th of April, in the Manchester Ship Canal. David's body was found in an area that had already been searched. From what I can gather, the body was located near an Imperial Museum. Examiner Live reported, Home Office pathologist Dr. John Rutherford said there was absolutely no evidence that David's passing was the result of foul play, and that the most likely cause was that of drowning. So first of all, most likely cause, so not definitively? Interesting. It was discovered that he was more than twice over the legal driving limit. I believe that David's friends believed that the drinks may have been tampered with. One of David's good friends said that he was usually a happy drinker, but this time he was uncharacteristically aggressive and annoyed. Interestingly, David's phone was later found upstream of the body by David's uncle despite the extensive search by the authorities. I'm not sure if it was in the water or on land. If the phone call started at 1:20 AM and he started screaming 10 minutes into the call, and the phone line remained open until 4:30 AM, I'm going to assume that the phone was found on land and never entered the water. I'm not sure how that makes any sense, but I doubt the phone would have survived for 3 hours submerged in the river. But then was saying that somehow he entered the water and the phone did not, so he dropped it beforehand? If that was the case, it also doesn't make sense that the police search missed the phone initially and it was only found after the body was discovered. Was it placed there then? None of that really makes sense to me. A coroner's inquest was held a year after this incident took place in April of 2005. The coroner recorded a verdict stating that it was an accidental drowning and that there was no evidence of foul play or substance abuse. Does that mean that there was no evidence that the drinks had been tampered with then? And it was a case of simply having far too much? Mike and Anne disagreed with this assessment. Mike stated that something had terrified him. He was on the phone, but he could not speak to us. And that wasn't because he'd had too much to drink. Anne added, the screaming and howling was so unearthly, we just thought it had to be something. So let's just get this straight. David's talking with Anne for 10 minutes and then suddenly bursts into this unearthly howl. Were the police really saying that that was just nothing? There may not have been any direct or physical evidence left behind of foul play, but I'd certainly argue that a terrified and prolonged scream might point to something untoward and unexpected happening, no? The circumstances laid out are just not gelling together at all. What on earth even happened here? Good actual Lord, I'm glad I'm not on my own with that assessment, because the former detective, Chief Superintendent Tony Blockley, also found the circumstances utterly bizarre, adding that he had questioned as to whether David might have been chased or lured to his final location. He also stated that if David had fallen into the water, the parents should have heard an obvious splash from the phone had that taken place. They heard no such thing. In fact, other than this unearthly howl as described, they didn't hear anything at all. No cars, no one else shouting or running, just a disturbing silence given the circumstances. Obviously unsatisfied with the verdict, Anne and Mike stated that there were just too many questions left unanswered. The circumstances surrounding this incident, the cause of David's distress, and what happened to him remains unknown. Now, let's move on to the United States of America. Dan Zamlin was 18 years old at the time while enrolled at the University of St. Thomas. Dan was said to be quite successful for his age. He was an intelligent young man that was very athletic too. He was also an Eagle Scout, and while we usually cover disappearances from rural and wilderness areas, this skill set he held wouldn't play much of a role in this scenario, as Dan didn't disappear from the wilderness, but rather from Minnesota's state capital, St. Paul. Dan vanished on the 5th of April 2009, but before that we have to go back to the night before on the 4th. Dan was out partying with a group of his friends not far from the campus down St. Clair Avenue. This was just supposed to be a fun-filled night together, full of drinking and laughter, but it seems that Dan may have had a little too much that night, as he reportedly got upset at the party in the early hours of the 5th. It's not clear what he was upset at, but he would leave the group at approximately 2 AM, unfortunately not telling anyone that he was departing. Dan found himself walking along the Mississippi River Boulevard next to St. Clair Avenue on a trail. There was a grassy area next to the trail and a wooded slope. Reports state that he was heading towards the university to meet with some other friends. At this time, one of his friends from the party, Anna, realised that he'd left and called his phone. This was approximately 2:30 in the morning, where Anna asked where he was and that she would come pick him up. The plan, I believe, was for Anna to come and get him and the two would drive back to her place. Witnesses stated that Dan was incoherent before the time he'd left, so it's not clear just how much understanding or control Dan actually had over himself at this point. Dan's location was west of the party and Anna began driving towards him. On the phone, she told him that she couldn't quite see him and to look out for her headlights. This is where things take a turn, as Anna was trying to find him suddenly, and while Anna did not later remember the exact wording, but in essence, Dan's final words to her would be something along the lines of, "Oh my gosh, where are you? Help." During this call for help, some kind of event had obviously taken place, though it's not clear what he saw or what was happening. But we do know that he must have become separated from the phone because Anna stated that his cry for help became increasingly distant, as if he was getting further and further away from the phone. At this point, contact with Dan was lost and the call ended, though the phone remained on. Anna must have told Dan's family because it was stated that Anna other friends of Dan's and his family were out looking for him and repeatedly attempting to make contact through the phone, but were only getting through to his voicemail. His phone would eventually run out of battery at 8:30 AM, which is when the authorities were notified. The search for Dan was massive, and over 1,000 volunteers joined the effort to help look for him. Alongside the authorities, people flocked to the river and were walking up and down the banks. When this effort continued to fail, sonar scans were then deployed in the hopes of determining his location in the water, which also revealed nothing. Bloodhounds were also brought to Dan's last known location, but there was no scent trail for Dan. There were other scent trails which we'll get to later. Helicopters with infrared flew overhead. Water patrol checked along the shore. Friends and family searched in culverts, brush, trees and valleys. And the University of St. Thomas organised a block-by-block, door-to-door search. Police did find a footprint leading away from the river in the direction of the road, but they could not say for certain that it belonged to Dan. Over the next 27 days that he was missing, more than 1,200 people searched for Dan Zamlin. This footprint was found in the area that Dan was last believed to be. Despite this, and given the search effort, I think it's rather clear that the authorities' conclusion was that Dan must have fallen into the water. Another interesting fact was that the search was terminated 4 days into it. That is very weird to me. Usually these searches extend over weeks, not days. I couldn't confirm this for certain, but Sally Zamlin, Dan's mother, reportedly stated that she was told by a senior commander, "Your son was a very troubled young man. We'll find him when the river gives him up. We don't have the time to look for him. We have 100 missing person cases a week." Good actual lord, if that's true and that was actually said, I can't even imagine how the family must have felt. I've no idea how anyone could be so insensitive in this situation given the circumstances and what's just occurred. While the official search seems to have been called off after 4 days for some reason, as said, for nearly a month others continued on, but all search efforts kept turning up nothing and no leads over and over again until the 1st of May. The Ford motor plant is situated on the Mississippi River south of the university. There he was found floating in the river by an employee of the plant roughly a mile away from where he'd vanished. Just like David Plunkett, he hadn't sustained any injuries at all, and thus there was nothing to suggest that he had taken a fall down the rocky embankment. This area had been repeatedly searched over a month's period, and now there he was. The initial coroner's report couldn't even determine a cause of passing. It seems that the authorities were nevertheless rather quick to write it off as an accidental drowning, despite any real evidence to this effect other than the presence of alcohol in his system. They declared it an unfortunate accident, and that was that. Dan's family, friends and classmates immediately challenged the official version of events and accused them of not only bungling the case but also attacking Dan's character when reports were released suggesting that this may have been a purposeful act by Dan due to an identity crisis. Dan's family were clearly not satisfied with the way the investigation had been done, nor their conclusions, and you can see why. The coroner never stated just how long he believed Dan's body had actually been in the water. Sally pored through hundreds of pages of reports and would find a wide range of inconsistencies, dropped balls, and evidence that disputed the official police report. She was the one who would determine that the coroner had found no injuries. She would also find that much of the police investigation hinged on witnesses who were problematic. There were inconsistencies in the statements made by those who last saw Dan and phone records that do not match up with witnesses' statements that he'd had too much to drink and was incoherent. Many said that he was in good spirits and hadn't had too much at all. Unhappy with the inconsistencies, Dan's family called for a second autopsy to be done, and this second attempt found that there was a presence of GHB in the liver that was higher than normal levels. Sally said she'd found out that Dan and others had a funny tasting drink at the party, which apparently made him and others ill. Sally wonders if it was this drink that was responsible for the high levels of GHB, which can lead to dizziness, loss of muscle control and consciousness. Dan was also diabetic, and apparently GHB can provoke a health episode in such people. The ultimate point Sally was making in the end was that she does not believe that this was an accident, as the coroner had concluded. One of Dan's friends, Courtney Anderson, had this to say about Dan. "I have always known Dan to be a careful person. He had a good head on his shoulders, and I just find it startling that the autopsy came back as an accidental passing. It just doesn't seem to me that the puzzle pieces are really fitting correctly." The authorities were then criticised for their search effort and their inability to find Dan in the first place, even with sonar scans. It's not clear to me though that Dan was even in the water at the time of the search, which we'll get to in a moment. And the police did state that they had no idea when or at what position he even actually entered the water, and stated that's something we may never know. Sally wrote an email to a journalist who had apparently written an unsavoury article about Dan. In the article, she relayed a number of interesting findings that she'd uncovered. Here are just some of them. Fact: drowning victims usually surface 6 to 10 days after drowning. Fact: the river was flowing 400 times faster than usual and was flowing 4 feet over the dam. Yet Dan's body only travelled 2 miles and didn't surface for 27 days. Fact: Dan's insulin pod was still attached. If the river was flowing so quickly, it does seem unlikely that the body had only travelled a couple of miles and hadn't surfaced for 27 days. That very much could indicate that he wasn't in the river for the entire time. Of course, he could have got snagged beneath the surface, but at that speed, it seems that he should have been much further along than he actually was. Fact: the St. Paul Police Department ruled out the river on April 9. Fact: cadaver dogs had 4 hits in the river and 4 bodies were found while Dan was missing. It's interesting that initially the authorities had concluded that he hadn't gone into the water. I wonder if that had something to do with the footprint. It's not clear to me exactly why they ruled out the river initially. Fact: 2 coroners determined that my son had no injuries to suggest a fall or jump into the river. Fact: the Ramsey medical examiner could not determine 100% that Dan did in fact drown, only that he was found in the water. I must admit, with everything I've heard, I do lean towards the idea that he was not in the river for the entire time he was missing. Though how he actually vanished and the means of which he did enter the water, I have no idea. I do believe that the family were thoroughly in the foul play camp, and believe that a third party was involved, and you can certainly see why they feel that way. Here's some final information on this. During the testimony before the House of Representatives, Dale, Dan's father, said that he believed Dan was taken. He said that although the missing persons unit quickly zoned in on the river area, other facts seemed to rule out the river. He noted that 8 bloodhounds had searched the area 2 or 3 days after he disappeared and kept stopping in the same place but did not go near the river. He also said that side-scanning sonar had been used to search the river as well as infrared. He also said that he works as a pit miner and walked through the area and did not feel that someone would easily slip there, and if they did, it would leave a mark. Nothing was in the area where Dan was found. Realistically, if he'd have fallen in, surely you'd expect to find some kind of evidence of a slide down the embankment, but of course, this was never found. It's also interesting that 8 separate bloodhounds had stopped at the same place that wasn't near the river, as Dale said. Could that have been the exact spot where he was taken then? And if so, taken how exactly? In what manner? What do you think happened here? Was this an accident, as the authorities seem to conclude in the end, or something more? I'm going to end this video now and hand it over to you in the comments below. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like, hit the bell, and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps me a lot. If not, then feel free to leave a dislike. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe, guys. Peace.